If you've followed immigration policy for any length of time, you know we're dealing with a system that is historically complex, heavily stacked, and deeply frustrating. Today we're unpacking Title IX of the POPULIST Act, which is all about unstacking immigration. Now, the POPULIST Act rests this entire massive overhaul on three connected ideas, but it frames them around an ancient, absolutely fascinating concept called Jubilee. It's a philosophy of repair and release, and it completely shifts how we think about fixing a broken system. Let's dive right in.
So what exactly is a Jubilee? Well, in this context, a cyclical time of release, repair, and national self-correction.
The POPULIST Act
Applies this ancient framework directly to immigration policy, asking a really pragmatic question. At what point do legal disabilities, punishments, and exclusions finally come to an end? It frames the whole project not as political theater, but as a systematic effort to actually repair what's broken and bring our laws back into alignment with reality.
Here is our roadmap for today. We're going to look at the three main ideas Title IX rests on: governing through actual law, making enforcement and lawful pathways fit together, and acknowledging the reality of time. And finally, we'll look at how this all connects to a much broader national vision.
Let's start with that first big idea, governing through law.
The POPULIST Act
Makes a hard pivot away from executive drift and puts the responsibility to govern immigration straight back onto Congress.
Leaving immigration policy to a web of endless executive actions, constant litigation, endless backlogs, and emergency funding, that simply isn't responsible government. Instead, Title IX insists on governing through funded congressional law. It's about replacing agency improvisation with clear policy, building real adjudication infrastructure, and creating workable rules that actually function in the real world.
But of course, you have to pay for that infrastructure. The Act shifts funding directly into capacity. We're talking about investing heavily in immigration courts and judge teams, ramping up USCIS adjudicators and staffing to clear out those massive backlogs, expanding FEMA shelter and child placement capacity, and finally modernizing DHS data systems. The whole goal is to build a machine capable of actually telling people yes or no in a timely manner.
Which brings us to this absolutely crucial statement: enforcement without adjudication is not order, it is congestion. If a government arrests or detains people but doesn't have the court capacity to make timely decisions on their cases, it hasn't solved the problem at all, right? It has just moved the bottleneck somewhere else. It's a really compelling, pragmatic way to reframe how we view border security and legal processing.
That brings us to the second connected idea: enforcement meets lawful pathways. Here, the Act strictly refuses to treat enforcement and legalization as competing ideologies. Instead, they have to fit together.
It's about striking a highly symbiotic balance. On one side, you have worksite verification, which targets the domestic demand for unauthorized labor and stops exploitation right at the source. But here's the catch: you can't successfully mandate that employers only hire authorized workers if there are no realistic ways for workers to become authorized in the first place. And that is exactly where legalization comes in. To actually make the enforcement side work, the text outlines a phased rollout for nationwide employment eligibility verification. Starting with the largest employers and trickling down phase by phase, by January 1st, 2029, every single employer in the United States will be covered. This directly addresses the root economic driver of unauthorized migration, which is the sheer demand for unauthorized labor by employers looking to cut corners. Legalization makes more sense when future employment is verified and employers cannot keep exploiting unauthorized labor. Worksite verification fundamentally justifies and stabilizes the logic of legalization. It ensures that moving forward, the rules of the game are clear, fair, and actually enforceable.
Moving to our third big idea, long-term residence matters, or acknowledging time. This brings us right back to that Jubilee framework we talked about at the very beginning. When do debts, exclusions, punishments, and legal disabilities finally end?
Title IX creates ways for the law to acknowledge time, contribution, family, and reality. It specifically targets three vital groups: childhood arrivals, essential farm workers who literally feed the country, and long-term unauthorized migrants who have lived in U.S. communities for many, many years.
For farm workers, the text draws on the bipartisan Farm Workforce Modernization Act. It sets up a very pragmatic ladder. Workers first earn a certified agricultural status based on their past labor. Next, they secure dependent status for their spouses and children. And eventually, through continued compliance in agricultural work, they earn lawful permanent residence. It ensures that the very people keeping our food supply chains running aren't permanently trapped in a state of legal limbo.
For childhood arrivals, it moves DACA from a fragile, temporary executive action into permanent statutory law. The logic presented in the source is simple but incredibly powerful. Children who grew up in the United States should not spend their adulthood treated as legal strangers in the only country they actually remember. And when it comes to long-term residence, the current law relies on a registry date that functions like a statute of limitations, but get this, it's been completely frozen at January 1st, 1972. That is wildly outdated. Title IX proposes replacing this rigid, fixed cutoff with a rolling, continuous 10-year residence rule, or a 4-year rule for students. It's the law finally recognizing the reality of the people who have built their lives here.
To further unstack the system, the Act also takes a hard look at legal immigration backlogs. It proposes almost doubling the employment-based immigration cap, taking it from 140,000 up to 270,000. By doing this, and by removing per-country limits, it addresses the artificial scarcity that currently leaves legal workers, students, and their families trapped in administrative purgatory for decades.
And that brings us to our final section, an interconnected vision. Because as we wrap up, it's vital to understand that Title IX doesn't exist in a vacuum. It has a deeply valuable relationship to the other titles in the broader Populist Act. When you fix a system this massive and foundational, the effects naturally ripple out.
By bringing workers out of the shadows, Title IX directly supports Title VIII, which is all about strengthening employment standards and fair wages. You can't have an honest, functioning labor market if a massive chunk of your workforce is easily exploitable. Furthermore, this fair, functional immigration system supports the civil liberty reforms of Title I, ensuring our justice systems aren't constantly clogged up with broken administrative border policies. Every piece leans on the others.
Ultimately, the pragmatic goal of this entire section boils down to this powerful thesis: the point is not to erase borders. The point is to build an immigration system that is clear, enforceable, humane, and worthy of a constitutional republic. Which leaves us with this final, lingering question to consider today. Are we ready to replace political theater and executive drift with a responsible, functioning immigration system? The Populist Act lays out a clear, interlocking blueprint for how that can actually be done. It's a lot of policy to digest, for sure, but understanding these structural proposals is absolutely key to understanding this debate.
Release, repair, and renewal. We can have a Jubilee in 2026. The United States can address its spiritual and economic debts by enacting the Populist Act. Learn more about this bright and bountiful future at votewithbrian.com.